Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome to this special edition of the LatinoED Talks conmigo, Amanda Fernandez. I'm the CEO and founder of Latinos for Education. Today, I'm very excited about this very timely topic on the Latino vote, and very excited to welcome our guest today. Our webinar topics will be on the media narrative on the Latino vote, which we heard a lot about following the election results. We're going to analyze the data behind the vote and then connect it back to education. What does this mean for education and Latino education in America? Today, I'm introducing our two special guests that will be having this discussion with us. Stephanie Valencia, who is a national leader and innovator at the nexus of Latino research and civic engagement, media, technology, and leadership development. She is the co-founder of Equis, a set of organizations working to create a better understanding of Latinos, innovate new approaches to reach and engage them, and invest in the leadership and infrastructure for long-term change and increased engagement. She is also the co-founder and executive board chair at Latino Media Network, a multimedia platform audio company inspiring, informing, and celebrating Latinos, and owned and operated by members of the community. Our second guest is Julio Ricardo Varela. Julio is an award-winning journalist and senior leader. He is the founder of the Latino newsletter, a new Massachusetts-based journalism and commentary nonprofit that's focused on the Latino community. He is also an MSNBC columnist on a freelance basis. Previously, he was president of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Futuro Media. Julio Ricardo was responsible for the business operations side of the organization and played a key role in overseeing the company's editorial vision. Before that, he was the company's editorial director, and he led teams at Latino USA, Latino Rebels, and the In the Thick of It political podcast. Julio's work has been featured in many global outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Journalism Review, The Atlantic, The Guardian, ESPN, NBC News, Face the Nation, Univision, and Telemundo. We've got amazing guests today, folks, and I'd like to welcome you both to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yo, what's up? We slid right in.
We slid right in. We got a lot to talk about. We had this prep call yesterday, and I thought, oh, wow. Okay, here we go. Are folks ready for this ride we're about to go on? Because you all have a lot to say, and we've got a lot to learn. So let's go.
And it's not actually that often we get to talk with one another. So it is a lot of
exactly like
that process together.
Yes, exactly.
Isn't that the truth? This processing as a community is super important. So thank you for naming that, Stephanie. I think it's actually cathartic and necessary for us to do this right now. So I'm going to start with you today, Julio, and have you just talk about the media narratives, because there was so much that came out right after the election that was confusing. It felt like the election results all was, laid on the hands of the Latino community. So talk to us about that. Set the stage. What was the media narrative coming out of the election?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll be as brief as I can be because it's such an important conversation, but let's go back a month because it's been a month.
Has it only been a
month? Years. And I think part of the problem with American political media is that we've treated it like sporting events, right? So there's such attention to what's going on, give us the results. And it's so competitive, like in a social digital space, everyone wants to report on what's the election telling us? Like, this is coming in. And part of the media sort of infrastructure that has had decades of this, right? American political media, there's always these national exit polls with Edison Research. They come out, right, Stephanie, they come out around like 5:30, 6 o'clock. It's like, ooh, what are the issues that people are talking about? Oh, the polls are still open. And then so that narrative's starting to get built, right? You have to realize when it comes to American political media that this is entertainment, right? And they want the eyeballs that night. And they, so they're gonna do a lot, right? And one of the things that actually came because it's so instant was the first exit poll. Edison Research said 54% of Latino men chose Trump. And that's where everyone just kind of latched on. And then Latinos like, Kamala Harris only got 51% of the national Latino vote. And we just went down a spiral, right? Because these are exit polls. And then there was another one by APCAS, which wasn't as like dramatic. And then there was another one called the American Electorate Poll. And that was going to be released the day of or on the day after election. There was a notice, it was all these organizations, a lot of Latino serving organizations, a lot of organizations that serve Black communities, Asian Pacific and Islander communities. And there was an email. It's like, we're going to share these results. And then the election happened. And there was an email saying, we're not going to share the results. We're going to take another week. So then there was a lot of emotion, right, in the space. And however we say it, as much as we want to, like, I love the fact that we're here, we're on screens, we're talking to each other, we're real people. But the rest of, everyone goes on social media and everyone has a take. Everyone goes on TikTok and everyone has a take. And there were things said. And in the heat of the moment, and there were a lot of Latino and Latina journalists who were, in essence, bullied online. There's no other way to put it. And that was it. Latinos lost the election for Kamala Harris. That was the narrative. And guess what, y'all? That's not the narrative.
That's not the truth.
It's not the truth. And that's where I'm going to leave it because and I'm totally setting up my colleague here. And I say this, I tell everyone, and I'm not like, this is what I mean about uplifting community. When you see Latinos and Latinas actually trying to look at the situation with the right data mindset, that have Latino and Latina voices and leaders like Stephanie saying, hold on a minute. The biggest thing that they did, which was really, really important during this time in the last month, was to kind of say like, yo, let's all calm down because these are all exit polls.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, please jump in because I think a lot of the work that Equis did sort of was so necessary.
Yeah.
And it was also very reassuring for a lot of political journalists like myself and others who were kind of like, I know I'm right. And I'm really glad that there was data. So take it away.
Thank you for that incredible setup. And I want to give kudos to the team at Equis who does the research day in and day out. Carlos, who is my co-founder and also has led and built an incredible research team, largely made up of Latinas, young Latinas who are entering into a space that is not historically really represented us, and is charting a new way and a new path for how we think about Latino voters. And I think it's important to remember, like when we started Equis 5 years ago, our goal was to maintain this like flame of truth of where Latinos actually really were. We get a lot of people coming to us offering to do this poll or that poll. And we turn a lot of those things down because we want to maintain the integrity of what we are looking at and that we are not beholden to anybody for what the results end up actually being. And I will just connect that back to Julio, to what you said, which is exit polls are polls. Polls are imperfect. They are snapshots in time. They are like dipping a toe in the water and coming back out in that moment in time. And so the exit polls is all over the place as the polls going into the election. And so the truth is we will not, and again, it doesn't satisfy the clickbaity need for really like rapid response and like, what are we going to say tonight? Like that, actually, the truth will not be fully borne out until like probably midway next year, where we have enough pieces of a puzzle to put together a mural to say like what actually happened. But here is kind of what we know for sure based on what we've seen now, which is for those of us who have been studying Latino voters for quite some time and this particular election specifically, what happened wasn't necessarily a surprise, because what we saw happening in the battleground states was consistent with what we saw happening in the battleground states for the last 2 years. Now, the part that was surprising was the magnitude and the depth of where it happened. And so at Equis, we like to say Latinos are not a monolith. But in this case, we are still not a monolith, but we moved as a group. And so there's something that that has to be said for when, Latinos are moving in battleground states, as we, kind of surmised and we're tracking. But also when Latinos are also moving in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where there was no really competitive election, to Newark, New Jersey, to South Texas, in a county that had been voting for the Democratic nominee for president for like 50 years. Like, when you see that level of shift, that is the signal of a more firm realignment. And what I would say is, this is a realignment that is very much attached to Trump. We have seen a 13-point shift from 2016 to 2024 among Latinos. In some places, it's been more accelerated. In places like Florida, where I'm sitting today, it's been more accelerated, kind of been a canary in a coal mine in some ways. But, Julio, to your point, like the narrative, while in the media that night of the election and kind of subsequently was like blaming Latinos, there is no group to blame,
Right.
no one group
Exactly.
to blame. And the one example I really love to use here, which is even if in a place like Pennsylvania, the erosion among Latinos were erased and we voted at the same levels we had in 2020, Kamala Harris would have still lost. So, again, it goes to show that, like, even in places like that were so consequential to the entire battleground map, even if Latinos attrition had not happened, the outcome would have still been the same. So I think what's going to be interesting to see as we move forward, because this has very much been attached to what we saw in focus groups around Donald Trump and his people's perceived sense of him around the economy, being a strong leader. Oh, he's not actually going to do all the bad things he says he's going to do. He doesn't really mean it. That all kind of played into kind of the moment that we were in, where we saw this really dramatic shift to Trump. Again, another group that gets blamed are Latino men in particular. Well, what we have seen from some of the initial data, and this will continue to bear out and we can get state specific, is the shift was also happening with women. So I don't know, while there may be greater leaps among men, it's untrue to say it was just men. And so I think there's also a whole conversation about what is it, maybe not around gender-based or whatever, but it's actually driven by class, is truly driven by the economy. And I think that's what we have to take kind of moving forward. And the last thing I will say to this point is, one of the most defeating parts of what I saw happen on election night and kind of the subsequent days was the blame. And the blame even from progressives to Latinos to say, well, you guys are going to get what you signed up for when they deport you. When the truth is, like, we shouldn't be blaming the voters who were put in a position whose, anxieties, like a set of conditions were created by, what we call the second COVID election, broader global trends around inflation and rising costs. Like, there was a reason people felt insecure and felt like this was the way they needed to vote, right? Like, and we can get into how far.
Yeah, and also and also this, and to Stephanie's point, Amanda, before I know we want to move on, but it's really important. We have to acknowledge the fact that for the last 8 to 12 years, sort of this canary in the coal mine, this notion that, Latinos were always in the bag for Democrats, like, that wasn't true. And it never kind of was. I think people tend to forget, and I'm talking, I tend to forget that there's always been this independent streak in polling when it comes to Latinos. And if you actually look at the history, I mean, I bring up La Raza Unida party in the 60s. I mean, this is not, this notion of us being taken for granted. This is not something that just happened like in 2024, right? Yeah. So, and Stephanie, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people, like 08 and 12, it was sort of our coming out moment during the Obama era. And there was a lot of hope. And then all of a sudden there was a little bit, like, as with any politician, not everyone delivers. It doesn't mean that those years were bad years or anything. It was just like what it was. And what was interesting to me, and just specifically when it comes to probably Latino millennials in the digital space, when I was sort of beginning to move independently into political blogging and it turned into Latino Rebels, we were seeing it already in 2011. People online going, I don't really believe in Democrats or Republicans. And little by little, it started chipping away. Even with the moment with Trump coming down the escalator, we were starting to see these moments, right? And then it just became sort of like normalized. And what I saw this time around, and I wrote a lot about this for MSNBC, this was an intentional campaign strategy by the Republican Party. And whether you agree with it or not, it was incredibly effective. And they found a way. And I remember he sat down with Enrique Acevedo a year ago at Univision. And he basically sat down and he said, you know what? There's some Latinos that are like us, and there's some that are not. And the campaign played us, the community, against each other, knowing that we were never a monolith to begin with. So however you say, so I think we have to look at this as political messaging. I think we have to look at this as like, outreach, and there's so many factors, but in the end, whatever the data says, right? And I'm just going to stick to exit polls, historical, and then I'll turn it back over to Amanda, but this is whatever you say, Donald Trump will have done as well or even better than the historic George W. Bush 2004, he gets us campaign. So that's a fact. And I think if we as a community are not accepting that, or are not realizing that there has been a shift, and we are more independently minded, and we don't really align ourselves to traditional parties. And I'm talking about the younger new voters who are, everyone's like the million Latinos that come and turn 18, whatever. This is a different political game. And those campaigns and politicians that realize that we are getting more complex are going to be on the head of this. So how's that for data and geekiness, Amanda?
Wow.
From the both of us.
Stephanie, do you want to comment? I appreciate so much what Julio talked about, and frankly, both of you, on dispelling these myths, because for the average person who's not as deeply, knowledgeable as the two of you are, it certainly was out there, that narrative of it's the Latino males, they decided it. And so just your coming here with those facts are super important for our whole community to understand and to clarify for our community. I did want to see if you wanted to comment in addition to what Julio talked about in terms of what you attribute these shifts to. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I may have a little bit of a different view in terms of I think that we have to put into two categories, what lost Democrats the election and what Democrats can be doing better. Because Democrats, certainly, Julio, I think Trump, I remember in 2016, one of the things that he did was he bought the YouTube masthead on election day, and played this video of him being endorsed by a UFC fighter.
Yeah.
And it was super smart strategy, because Latinos over-index on YouTube, and that was 2016. You can't do that on YouTube anymore, actually, but there were other strategies that they have been employing including.
Well, I think the Latino Americans one was a very intentional one. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I was just giving you an example of
Yeah, and meanwhile, Democrats on the other hand are kind of putting out fact sheets that are speaking to Latino male agenda, but is that actually what people care about? Or again, what lost us the election, these global factors, was the Biden administration doing what it should have been doing the first 2 years on the issue of the economy and immigration? Were they responding to the actual anxieties and challenges that people had in those first 2 years as swiftly and as aggressively as possible, that made people feel they were responding to their needs? I don't think so. And I think that was the moment of wet concrete that Democrats had and that Joe Biden had. Fast forward 2 years later, people had kind of calcified, and just the issue of immigration. I have been working on this issue for many, many years in Congress, in the White House. I've seen all sides of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it has been fascinating for me to see over this last 10 years, Latinos lose faith in Democrats on the issue of immigration. Like this, and it comes from both sides. Like the people who feel like the border should be more secure and that there should be order and control at the border, it really comes down to fairness. Like, to be honest, like it is an issue of fairness for many people. And those who feel like when Democrats have been in power, they have not used that power to actually advance an agenda that is common sense, right? Like, which includes, at the most basic level, DACA and Dreamers,
Right.
but other legalization of other people and creating an orderly system. So we have to also acknowledge that, to your point of like, who are these people that Democrats are losing? I kind of, you know, Carlos and I have been talking about them in a couple of camps. There are certainly a subgroup of Latinos that are becoming more conservative and more Republican. And that is, you know, a subsegment. But a large segment of the population that is largely working class, that is largely what I call not hyper partisan. Like they are they are not necessarily like totally independent, but they're like, yeah, sometimes I'm going to vote for that guy and sometimes I'm going to vote for that guy over there.
Exactly.
It really comes down to the candidate and the policy and what that moment in time and who they feel like is good. And I think that's the universe of Latinos that are ripe for Democrats to go and persuade and connect and engage with on the issues that really matter to them. But slapping Latino on a fact sheet or slapping Latino on a website like isn't going to cut it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things the Trump campaign and Republicans have really gotten right in these last couple of years or last couple of cycles has been really leveraging and going to the places where people are. There's a reason he's showing up to UFC fights. Like there's a reason like he is showing up in some of these places. And one of my critiques of kind of the operation that I saw coming, or were the surrogates that were being deployed, did they look like and speak like the people we were actually trying to persuade? Yeah. Or were they like kind of another universe of people? So all that is just to say that, like, I think a lot was driving what happened this election. There's stuff that Democrats can and should be doing better. I don't think that if Democrats even spend another $20 million to reach Latinos, that would have won them the election either, because there were certain dynamics and factors happening globally and in the country across all subgroups. And again,
everyone shifted right, is what you're saying. Like the day, like there's no sector in the United States during this election that was like, oh, by the way, like
exactly,
there wasn't a shift to the right with this group.
Even young Black men shifted.
Yeah.
So the path forward, in my view, really does have to be one that centers in economic class-based approach, because that is ultimately what is driving people. And I've got a whole set of TED Talk on that too, but we will keep going for a moment. Lots of thoughts on that.
Amanda, you need to just like jump in because Stephanie and I are just having like this like top line conversation, and I hope people are enjoying it.
Look, I'm having fun just being a fly on the wall, listening to the two of you. But I was struck by your comment, Stephanie, in terms of when things started to shift, and this has been sort of a couple years ago that this started happening during the Biden administration. And I just wonder if the response to COVID, in the aftermath of COVID, and the response given the impact of COVID on the Latino community, we'll have a sense of that. What is your thought on how that may have impacted things?
I would say two things. One is, I think I said this earlier, but it's worth repeating. This was the second COVID election. Like COVID election one was in 2020 when people were still wearing masks and it was still very like at the height of the health crisis of COVID. This was like the residual effects of COVID, the residual economic effects of COVID. And I think there is no community in some ways in the United States that is more impacted by the economic downwind shifts and downwinds of the broader economy than Latinos, because we are 3/4 of Latino community in this country is working class. Like, you know, the rising cost, like inflation and the rising cost of goods, like disproportionately impacts Latinos. You know, sending your kids to goods, all of these like bread and butter issues, like disproportionately impact our community. So I would say like the economy on one side, like in and of itself, people not feeling like the investments the Biden administration was making, whether, you know, Inflation Reduction Act, you know, the Biden administration, the White House would argue like all the best policies. And by all signs, like the stock market was better, unemployment was low, but like, did people feel it? And the truth is they did not. And they saw Joe Biden spending however many billions of dollars in Ukraine. And there was like lots of other stuff happening. They're like, well, what about us? Like, we are still suffering here. And so they saw a path forward with somebody like a Trump, who they saw as like, in fact, we were in focus groups last week and somebody said like, he's the guy we need in the moment. Yeah, he's a little racist, but I can kind of put up with that because what America needs right now is a strong economy. And people are struggling and they're looking everywhere to be able to find a way to survive, not survive, but thrive. I was in an Uber here last week in Miami, and the guy had 2 iPhones. He had an iPhone with the GPS, and the other iPhone was the crypto market. And this guy, I started talking to him about it, and he's like, basically, it came down to, you know, I invest a little money here and there, and it becomes more, right? Like, and so there's this like, not just entrepreneurial spirit, but a spirit of, I want to be successful. And they see Donald Trump as being successful and having made it. And so whether he did it on his own volition and through his own hard work, like we all have opinions about that, but people see it as success, which is, you know, part of it. The last thing is immigration. And immigration really, I think, you know, another TED Talk, but TED Talks that I just, you know, do
just list them all, Stephanie. You're going to be busy.
but it is, you know, Democrats like putting their heads in the sand on the issue of immigration. There are a few things that Democrats just, in my view and experience, have really just seen as too complicated. And so avoid it like the plague, right? Like immigration has become one of those things that's like, well, you know, we're going to talk about this, but not about this. Or, you know, we're not going to talk about the border because it's like too hard, right? Like, and Florida is another one of those things that's like too hard, that like we've just like walked away from Florida because it's too hard to like figure out. And now, you know, it is what it is. So immigration was like another one of those things that, because the Biden administration wasn't responding quickly enough to what was happening at the border. And again, I think there was a pathway and a needle to thread that could have been done to show force and order without with also compassion and common sense, because that's what we were seeing in focus groups, as people were like,
oh, it was so clear. I was just saying that, just to stay on this point, because I think there was a piece in the Atlantic today that someone sent, and I was like, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with this notion of the immigration debate. Now, I've argued that the immigration debate has been controlled and owned by Republican narratives, but there's never been a strong counter argument in the last 5 to 6 years that had boldness, right? And I think, to your point, Stephanie, and a lot of the research that you've done and others, there's always been this sort of sentiment that something needs to happen, right? And if people tend to forget, day one, Joe Biden, executive order, let's go. Like, brought an immigration bill to the Hill. Like, let's go, right? And I think part of that momentum got lost in all the Remain in Mexico. And I completely agree with your take, in the sense that we were still living in the pandemic And we still like, you're like, my mind is a little bit blown. It's like, yeah, this is the second pandemic election. And I will totally cite you at all times, Stephanie, when I mention it and any of my TED Talks. But now that you put it in that context, it was a lost opportunity to what the Democratic Party forgot to do was to make the connections between the economy and migration and why we need this and competitiveness and why you're going to be successful. And it was way easier, you know, it was way easier for the Republican Party to go to a first generation immigrant family, which he did well with, and say like, hey, you believe in the American dream, right? Like you're in. Like, and I know that sounds super simplistic.
Nope.
But that's the way a sector of our community thinks.
Yep.
And whatever the Republican Party was selling, when it comes to that message, it worked, right? And so, because the counter to what Democrats were offering, I still don't know what they offered.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. And so there was never a clear contrast. What you have was because you look at the GOP platform, first 2 points of the GOP platform in 2024 was, we're being run over, there's an invasion, and we're going to have the largest mass deportation policy in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
What needed to happen, and I think this is where there was a lot of Latinos who were like, where's the boldness?
Yeah.
When it comes to this. And I think that's where I think a lot of the disconnects and a lot of even when it comes to being an entrepreneur and running a small business, you look at all the data the last couple of years from the federal government about how Latinos are like crushing it with small business ownership. But who was the economy candidate? Who was the small business candidate? So there's a lot there, and I'm sure there's other questions, Amanda. I have never talked about this. Yeah, Stephanie and I have never talked about this.
I know. It
so
seems like there's some therapy happening here.
Yes.
Yeah, getting it all out. No, I know we have to have another, probably two other of these ED Talks, one on immigration and one on the phenomenon of cryptocurrency, because that's another fascinating area. But look, you just talked about sort of the difference in messages on topics or lack thereof, right? Or the narrative and a counter narrative. Let's talk about education, because that's what I've been thinking a lot about, is the education of our Latino community and how it relates to voting patterns and what we care about. And so, you know, there was a lot of talk about of what was most important in education. And on the one hand, you had relative to education, the discussion or the hot button issues that were brought up by the Trump campaign on book bans and Bible teachings in schools, you know, these sort of hot button issues, but they rose up to be issues, social issues in the context of education. And I didn't see, and maybe you two can clarify, I didn't see any kind of counter relative to what were the priorities of the Harris campaign in education. And our community certainly always has education top of mind. So I'd love for the two of you to comment on education as a topic and an issue.
I started as a journalist, as a student journalist, and I wrote for the Boston Globe, and then I couldn't get a journalism job in the 90s, and I went into educational publishing. So I ran bilingual ESL departments for Houghton Mifflin and traveled all over the country and visiting public schools and realizing that the future of public schools in America was inherently Latino. And this was in the 90s. And I would be like, hi, 30% of all like public school kids are going to be Latino in 2020, in the 2020s. And people were like, that's 30 years from now, dude. Right? Mm-hmm. Here we are. Right? Here we are. Like, public education has a very Latino face now, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of needs. not only when it comes to English language learners, when it comes to the gap, right? The achievement gap, all the things that are happening. Like we're mobilizing up, and we're following this classic pattern of it's our turn to mobilize up, and public education and education is going to be a major part of this. We've seen this before when it comes to book bans. When I bring up the situation in Tucson in 2011 and 2012 with the Mexican American studies and books being banned. So the playbook was already there. So anyone that wasn't following that, and then all of a sudden wakes up in 2024 and say, like, why are we banning books of, from authors of color and all this? It's like, we've been there. Go to Tucson Unified School District. Yeah. It's only 13 years ago. And there was a court battle. And so that's also part of the problem, is that I think this is where it gets to our voices being heard in political messaging. And this is a perfect example. And if you look at education, it's a perfect example of, like, I wish there were more Latino and Latina voices in education, like telling campaigns what to do. Because I think there would have been.
We tried.
Yeah, I know you did. You did, Amanda.
We have a Latino agenda.
Exactly. But this is what I'm saying. But I think like as much as we look at the numbers, as much as we say, we're going to go out and vote and we're going to be the next powerful voice, we're just getting started, right? We're still not fully at the table, right? So we have to continue to share our histories, share our stories, make the connections, understand that education, at least for a lot of these working class families, this is the ticket to the American dream. Mm-hmm. This is it. This is it. So when you start hearing the Department of Education being eliminated, like, if that were to happen in the next 4 years, and I cover it. I mean, I've talked to Secretary Cardona several times. It would be devastating to our communities. So I don't, Stephanie, I know you have data. I mean, I don't know what the data says about, like, how parents and families feel about education, but I do think it's one of those, like, tenets in our community that we don't talk enough about. So I'll leave it at that and let my colleague jump in.
I will say I have kind of a few thoughts here. One thought is that for the first time ever in the cycle, education was not, like, one of the top policy issues for Latinos. It was the economy, it was immigration, and education, usually the economy, education, or the economy and healthcare as, like, the top three. And education would, like, kind of go into different parts of the agenda. So, like, one, that was, like, a huge shift, because in the past, like, education was very much like a driving force, because people want to make sure their kids have, but, like, I think it just goes to show, like, families, Latino families, and I think this goes beyond Latinos, like, their concerns and their anxieties were being driven by something that was, like, far more survivalist, which was, like, the economy and could they put food on the table? Like, first and foremost, not could they send their kid to school, but, like, could they, like, how are they keeping up from an economic perspective? So that's, like, one observation, is, like, what we saw in the data. Second, I think that we have to, as we think about education as an issue, one thing Republicans have done, and I think very smartly, that I think Democrats should think about doing too, is not treating education like a silo issue, but treating it as a families and parents issue. And, like, how, and really, they've kind of taken that to an extreme level in terms of, how they think about family and parents, et cetera. But what I've heard in, like, focus groups and in the research has been that, like, people want parental control. Like, they want to be able to, like, understand where they're sending their kid to school. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of our education agenda, or the Democrats' education agenda, has been framed in a woke lens, like, that makes people feel like, well, this isn't what I stand for, or, like, this isn't what I'm looking for. And so I think there's got to be a way to think about, how do we protect banned books and advocate for broader stories to be told, and not let that be the label of who we are and how we are labeled, what our priorities are. Because our priorities are making sure every kid in this country has access to a quality education. And what does that actually mean? And can go to college and student loans, et cetera, et cetera. We saw some interesting stuff on student loans. It wasn't on student loan forgiveness. It wasn't necessarily as popular with Latinos as I had originally thought it might have been, because some people saw it as a handout. And so
Yeah.
I think that's just like an interesting thing. There were some groups that it did work better with, and in terms of kind of taking something off their kids' plate so that they could kind of advance economically and move forward without being saddled with debt. It was all in kind of like the message, but I also thought that was kind of interesting. So education is one of those issues that, for all the reasons we have stated, like it is, Latinos are like a top stakeholder, and it is important to think about what is driving Latino voters' concerns around the issue of education. Like, how are they approaching it? And again, like, I think a framing around parents and family centered messaging and policy is the way to go, rather than kind of a siloed, like kind of education approach, which is, I think, unfortunately, what happens a lot in DC.
Interesting. So given this messaging around families and parents, I'm always struck by sort of gaps in knowledge amongst families relative to their own students' outcomes and how they're doing in school. One of our partners, an organization called the Learning Heroes, does research on this, so sort of family perceptions on how their children are doing in our education system. And this is not just Latinos, but nearly 90% of parents believe their child is at or above grade level in reading and math.
Yeah.
And we know, especially for Latino and Black children, those numbers are about half. They're at about 40% in terms of reading and math levels. I mention this because it's important that our families understand what's happening to their own children relative to their educational access and achievement and outcomes. And I'm going to sort of, within that context, when our students are not achieving at the levels that that we think that they are, we know what the outcomes are, which is what we see in terms of college access and completion issues, and even access to what is now very popular, which is multiple pathways, right? Career and technical pathways, et cetera. We're still seeing fewer Latinos having access to vocational programs, et cetera. So with that context, and that's going to kind of close out our conversation before we open it to questions, what do you think in terms of the educational outcomes of Latino students and how it's going to affect elections of the future? And what does that mean, and what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. Do you want to go in, Stephanie, or do you have a thought? Or?
Yeah, I'll just start by kind of taking a crack at one approach to thinking about it. I think one of the things that has really driven our work at Equis has been not that we think that Latinos should be allegiant to one party or another, but rather that like Latinos see themselves as powerful and influential and that they belong here. And, one of the measures of feeling like you belong, we believe, is voting. But another example that I commonly use is a parent advocating for their kids' education, showing up for a teacher conference, showing up to the PTA, all of those things. Part of why I think, again, this is our hypothesis, and again, that drives our work is what we call the guest complex, which is, if Latinos feel like guests in this country, if you're a guest in somebody else's house, you don't sit down without permission, let alone move the furniture. And if Latinos have been told like, you don't belong here and you are not part of this country and you are othered over here, and media and culture and entertainment continues to tell you that and reinforce that notion, like chances are you're going to feel like you need to be at the back of the room, right? Like, and that you can't go into somebody else's house. And so I think this parental involvement question, how much parents are involved, how much they advocate for their kids, largely can probably be tied back to how they feel, whether they belong or not in their community and in this country. And do they feel like they have the tools? Do they feel like they're welcome to the party of their kid's school or their kid's school district? Like they are invited to participate, which to translate into the political space and the civic engagement spaces, have the parties issued an invitation for them to come to the party? And if so, what's that invitation like? And do people feel like they are invited to be part of that party and that they're welcome there? And not political party, but just the party of civic participation. So that to me is in part like an answer to this question around parental involvement, is how do we make our community feel like we are powerful and influential in all parts of our life?
Just to jump off of that, because this is about storytelling and about elevating voices and about opening up those opportunities. And every one of us on these screens are kind of doing it differently with the things that we're working on, but it's still the same goal, right? So like when I founded the Latino newsletter in May, it was a very simple question. What is this? Do we have political power in this country? And I answered that question and I said no. So I'll say why? Why are we here? And it's for that very same reason that you're saying, Stephanie. It's like we don't see ourselves. We're not uplifting each other. We're not bringing up these issues. We're not having conversations amongst each other in a way that needs, like, that are real conversations that are honest, that we have to, we have a lot dividing us. The external forces divide and conquer us a lot, and we don't do enough internally, right? So I am all for whatever we can do to get to what we're creating civic-minded individuals, whether it's on the education space, whether it's what you're doing, Stephanie, whether I'm doing in journalism. But in the end, the only way you achieve power in this country is through your voice and through your vote. And the respect, we don't get it right now. So we have to go grab it, right? It's not going to come to us for that very same reason. It's like, oh yeah, you're here. Welcome to the house, but don't touch the furniture. Like don't rock the boat, right? Because you're going to be a bad guest. And I do think we're kind of past that, right? And if the only way we're going to achieve sort of that next wave is to continue to not forget where we came from. So like, I'm a big believer in young Latinos and Latina kids understanding that, when you hear about mass deportation, we've been there. There's a history. I'm so proud of that high school student in California that did a great piece on NBC News in October saying, like, I didn't even know this happened in my country. These are my people getting deported. These are my, and it was on NBC News and it went viral. Like, we have to continue to uplift sort of this desire to have people express themselves in our community. And we're all amplifiers. We're all storytellers. So I know that's a big, big answer to your question, Amanda, but what the hell not? That's what we swing for the fences now in 2024.
That's what we signed up for.
That's right. I think we all
exactly
said in our own capacity. I mean, we during the pandemic launched Familias Latinas por la Educación, which is a family engagement program. It's all about teaching our familias in our communities about their rights and what they are equipped and able to do so that they don't feel like guests in their own school communities and can feel free to learn. And they need to learn how to do it here and learn how to navigate and get into the school system and learn what the issues are, because it starts to lead then into civic engagement that then will be passed on to their children. So we see definitely the power of what programs like that can do for our community so that they don't feel like guests. And what came to mind for me was coming, not sitting on the furniture, or that furniture being covered in plastic, right? So that
Yeah, well, of course, there is that layer of it too. That is.
I'm having bad childhood memories now. I want to get to the questions.
I mean, that kind of happened in our own families too. But look, we have time for a few questions before we close out. So I have a question here that I want to share with you all and have you comment for a few minutes while we have about 5 minutes left for questions. Yolanda Wilcox Gonzalez submitted a question about colorism. How might colorism within the Latino community, how might it have influenced political involvement and voting in the election?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I can only talk about my reporting and what voters told me. And sadly, that's still an issue. And I don't think it's an issue that we should ignore. But, were there Latinos who didn't want to vote for a Black woman president? Yeah. I mean, they told me. I mean, and I'm here in 2024 going, okay, a lot of, to me, I don't want to simplify that either, because I don't want, sometimes, I'm a big believer. It's like, you only vote, you might vote, there might be 10 reasons why you're going to vote for somebody or vote against somebody. Right. So, and I'm not trying to minimize your economic situation or whatever your interest is, but I do think if we're not looking at that and not discussing it and not doing more studies or actually do more reporting on it, then that's shame on us. And I've been someone as a journalist who's been covering this issue for years. It gets a little bit frustrating because you're kind of asking the same questions and you don't see that advancement. And then when you see, voters who will look at colorism, it's like, this is who we are, right? Like, you're overreacting, Julio. Like, this is who we are as a people. And I'm like, that's the problem sometimes. So, I can only dedicate myself to what I can do, but we would be foolish to not say that there were plenty of Latino and Latino voters who wouldn't vote for a Black woman president. Like, that to me is, I'm not going to sugarcoat that at all.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the data has yet to bear out, like, how many people, and this will probably be more qualitative in like focus groups and stuff that we'll get over time. Like, was that their primary reason or a secondary reason, or like a reason for, just another reason that they had because they were looking for like a quote unquote stronger leader. So I think that's totally agree. And I think the data will just continue to bear out like how much of it will be, and how much are people going to actually admit to a pollster, like at the end of the day.
Exactly. It's like, hi, I'm racist. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. It's not that some people want to talk about it, but the thing is, it is still inherent. I'll leave. I'm sorry. Like, I don't want to linger, but
one more question.
Yeah. But one, it was shocking when I went to Western Massachusetts and talked to a lot of Latino voters on election day, and people were like they would use colorism words in Spanish to describe Kamala Harris. And this is in Western Massachusetts. And it was just like, it just would come off your tongue as if it was like, well, that's the way we speak. And I'm like, okay, there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
there is. And speaking of work to do, this is not an easy question, but will require just a couple of brief answers from each or one of you. And then we'll close out. So what are some clear actions that each of us can take in terms of, is it about creating a system of coalitions, sort of this idea of Latino engagement, and how do we come together, clear actions we can take to be informed and to bring our community along?
I think my answer is pretty straightforward and pretty simple, which is listen. Like, we've got to go into a period of listening, really trying to understand what drove people to this set of decisions. And it is also our duty and responsibility to, as I kind of started with, like, the mandate in my mind is very much around Trump and being a strong leader in the economy. The mandate from Latinos, again, consistent with what we've seen over time, was not mass deportations and separation of families. While people want to see common sense approaches to immigration, things that actually move forward and like real solutions that get implemented, I don't think the election results can be interpreted as a rubber stamp from Latinos for, what could be a very draconian, inhumane policy. And they will overplay their hand at a certain point, I'm sure many points, by overplaying who they consider to be relevant people that they can deport. And they will do awful things, and it will be on us, the media, to tell those stories. Because that, in my view, is not at all what we saw in our research that Latinos were signing up for. They were signing up for a strong economy, somebody who could get the economy back on track in a way that it trickled down to them in a meaningful way. And so that is something we are going to have to be mindful of. But more importantly, like, we have to listen and we have to try to understand.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd be very brief, Amanda, about this. But it's not only listening, it's understanding that we are complex and we have to have these honest conversations. Like, we have to break it down. We have to start all over again in a lot of ways, because I do believe we're past, and I hate when, like, I say it now, I'm repeating it all the time, but whatever the Latino vote was for the last 30 years, it's over. We are now moving on to a next phase where it's just going to get more and more complex and more nuanced in a lot of ways. So I think the more you can really not just fall into the trap of resistance media and stop living in one camp or another and begin to face some of this, I think is important, because we have to put our community first above politics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. Those were really nice ways to close this conversation for tonight, with some reality check for our community about what we've got to face and the power of listening, moving on to this next phase, and listening all around to many perspectives. And so thank you so much for this time today and your wisdom, experience. And I know I'll be having you back, because
we don't like to talk at all, the two of us.
Well, I mean, I was like pulling teeth. My goodness.
I know.
I mean, come on, as a moderator, you're like, just let them talk. This is awesome.
Look, the next one will be LatinoED Talks con Stephanie and Julio. And I
know you were great. We love this. You have a great organization, Amanda. Like, the work, and all the people. Like, thank you for doing this. This is so important.
And I just want to say to the audience, we're at close, but we can't have these conversations without support from our community. And so we are at the year end, and we've got a giving campaign at Latinos for Education. So if you'd like to see and hear more LatinoED Talks, we invite you to donate even any small amount to Latinos for Education as we close out this year. And what a closeout with LatinoED Talks and having the both of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And happy holidays. Feliz Año Nuevo.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.